Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Anglada. I am calling in this evening from Cincinnati Mound here in the southwest corner of Wisconsin, just a few miles away from the great Mississippi River. We are here on Ho-Chunk, Meskwaki, Sauk, and Iowa lands here. And this is part of my ecological programming series that I offer through Cincinnati Mound here. This is also an event through the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Project ongoing education series, which is really robust, and we can put some more information on that in the chat for you all. Really excited to have Liz Carlisle with us this evening. I've been reading this wonderful book that she wrote not too long ago, Healing Grounds, Climate Justice, and the Deep Roots of Regenerative Farming. Liz has also previously written a book called The Lentil Underground. And Liz teaches out at UC Santa Barbara, is at Stanford this evening. And fun little fact about Liz while looking up information is a country and Western musician, has her own album and everything, so is legit. So thanks so much, Liz. What we're gonna do, if everyone could maintain being muted, Liz is going to talk for a while, and then there will be an opportunity for some questions. If you have a question, you can add that into the chat, and perhaps we'll even do a raising of hand and unmute. So for now, I will turn it over to you, Liz. Thanks so much. What an honor to have you.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited about this conversation, and just really appreciate all of your engagement. And I have to say also that early in my career as a musician, I was hosted by a community of Catholic sisters in Kansas for a really unique folk music series that they were hosting. So it feels like a wonderful full circle for me in my career this evening, because I know we have a bunch of Catholic sisters here, Nuns and Nuns, Cincinnati Mound community. So thank you all so much for having me. It's great to join you from here. I'm at the Stanford Educational Farm on Muwekma Ohlone land. I was having some internet issues, and my partner works here, so he very sweetly is hosting me this evening so that I can come to you cleanly over the Zoom, hopefully. So I will go ahead and share my screen here, so just bear with me for a moment. Now I switch over to that. How do things look for you all out there? Do you see a slide that says Healing Grounds? Nice. Okay, we're literally on the same page then. So I'm going to jump in here and tell you a little bit about what I've learned in researching this book. But I wanted to start by just telling you a little bit about why I got interested in this topic in the first place. And that's because my grandmother, who was a really important person in my life, grew up on a homestead in Western Nebraska. And I really admired her deep connections to land. She had this wisdom and this groundedness to her that really came, it seemed to me, from having that really deep connection with land from her earliest years. And she had all these great stories about growing up on this farm. But then her family lost that farm in the Dust Bowl, which was a tragic experience for the whole family. They lost their farm, they lost their home, they lost their community in many ways. She ended up going and hiring out to another family and doing chores so that she could buy shoes for high school. It was a really big change in all of their lives. And so her stories about that period really planted a seed in me in thinking about regeneration, because she recognized that her father had been given bad advice about how to manage that land. They'd overplowed that land, and that's ultimately why it experienced such extreme soil erosion. And as I started reflecting on it later in my own life, thinking about, how did my family end up on this indigenous land in Western Nebraska in the first place? So I come to this work around regenerative farming really from a deep yearning for healing on land. And how do we repair this extractive relationship with land that has characterized the colonial period on this continent for the last few hundred years? And how can we bring together the healing of land and bringing of carbon back into soil with repairing all of those social processes of extraction as well? So jumping in here. Yeah, so this is the question that I've been asking in my research really for the last 12 years as a researcher and a writer who goes and interviews farmers who are working on regenerative and agroecological techniques is, how much might we really impact the climate problem through these soil health-based techniques on farms? So as a person who, comes from a rural background, this way in which agriculture is implicated in the climate crisis has always really haunted me. That currently we have a food system, an agricultural system that accounts for a quarter to a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. But on the other hand, of course, agriculture involves growing plants. And in an ideal world, if we do that in a regenerative way, it's possible to really transform agriculture from a source of carbon and a source of climate emissions to a carbon sink. And so I've always really been compelled by this potential for transformation of agriculture from a climate problem to a climate solution. So I've been really interested in this again for about the past dozen years and have become part of a movement in the United States that has started calling itself regenerative agriculture. It's a pretty new term. I'd say it emerged in popular discourse around 2015. And so I found myself at field days like this one, where farmers and scientists and often chefs and food manufacturers and other folks in the food system as well are talking about how to put carbon back into the soil. And if you go to a field day like this, and some of you may have, maybe some of you have hosted them, you might see one of these really powerful demonstrations, somebody holding up 2 handfuls of soil, one that's dark brown and crumbly and smells amazing, and then one that's kind of pale tan and hard as a rock. And this is, of course, a before and after demo. And you're likely to hear about the techniques the farmer used to transform that lifeless hardpan on the left into the carbon-rich earth on the right. And you'll also probably hear at field days like this, and I certainly have over the last dozen years or so, about some of the techniques that farmers use in order to reinfuse life and carbon into the soil. So one that I've always really loved, here I'll wave at the motion detector lights, is cover crops. So crops that are not harvested but used to feed the soil. They build up soil carbon, they improve resilience to drought and floods because when you have more soil organic matter, the soil can hold more water. And as a result, they also reduce runoff and reduce nitrogen traveling into the atmosphere as pollution as well. And in addition to cover crops, regenerative farmers are excited about rotating crops in general, even their cash crops, to add biodiversity, recycle nutrients, and also there's other benefits for the farmers, like breaking up pest and disease cycles and diversifying their income. Another technique, especially in the Midwest, you hear a lot about is reducing tillage. So leaving crop residue on the field rather than plowing. And the reason this has an impact on soil carbon is that soil microbial communities aren't as disturbed if you reduce tillage or use less heavy implements, or even just sort of change the way that you plant so that there are some points in the planting schedule when you're not tilling in between crops. And then finally, for farmers who have livestock or maybe who have neighbors who have livestock, rotating animals through pastures in ways that actually mimic the grazing behaviors of native herbivores can both over time boost forage, and then in boosting the forage, it's also boosting the carbon below ground. So these are all things that I've been hearing about and getting really excited about over my last 10, 12 years, going to these kinds of field days, interviewing farmers who are involved in regenerative agriculture. But I have to say at the start It was kind of an alternative movement, the kind of thing you might hear about if you shopped at a co-op or majored in environmental studies, or maybe you had a cousin who was taking over the family farm and determined to shake things up. But a few years ago, there was a real turning point when regenerative agriculture started getting a lot of mainstream attention. And I can't imagine anybody's going to be able to read the fine print down there of this graphic. But here it is a little larger. This is actually a marketing infographic from General Mills, one of many mass market food brands that have started investing in converting their supply chains to regenerative methods in recent years. And my students often get excited about it and come seek out my classes because they saw one of these two major documentaries, Kiss the Ground, which is full of celebrities, and Biggest Little Farm, which has really brought this topic into celebrity culture and into the awareness of a lot of folks who've watched these documentaries. And then, the other way in which a lot of other folks are talking about regenerative agriculture beyond this kind of alternative movement that's been working on it for decades, the International Panel on Climate Change has started talking a lot more about the land use component of climate solutions and where agriculture fits into that. And this particular special report in 2019 really put regenerative agriculture on the map for the climate policy community. And so all of a sudden, it was in the news for that reason. Prince Charles actually got really excited about this. The president of France started this 4 per mil project, this idea of trying to add 0.4% of soil carbon annually across the world's agricultural lands. And so, all of this for me was exciting as a person who saw regenerative agriculture as something that would really help rural communities and rural economies and allow farmers to really be part of the climate solution. And now to see, starting 5-10 years ago, this being discussed in all these mainstream venues, it seemed like there was a chance to really push for a lot of change. But at the same time, here I am in the research community, chatting with scientists and starting to see papers like this come out. Scientific journals with titles, like Managing for Soil Carbon Sequestration, Let's Get Realistic. And the authors of this particular article pegged regenerative agriculture's carbon offset potential at no more than 5%, which was not even a quarter of what some of the estimates were coming out of the community, like 4 per mil, that said, we could probably offset a quarter of human caused emissions this way. So there was this big gap between people who thought that this farmer-driven climate solution could really be a big piece of the pie in terms of reducing and removing emissions, and then a whole other part of the research community who normally, these folks would all be kind of on the same page around agriculture and climate. They really disagreed about how impactful these practices could be in reducing emissions. And this really got me wondering about, why was there this big gap in these estimates? Were there different versions of regenerative agriculture out there, some of which were more impactful than others? Were people just counting the carbon atoms differently? And this was kind of the beginning of researching a book. And so, and actually, this book process started for me at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. I started working on the book a couple months before the pandemic. And so it really changed the way I had planned on researching the book. But it also led to some very deep conversations in that context. So it started on Zoom. I started talking with regenerative agriculture leaders, and 4 in particular who I had deep conversations with, who helped me answer this question that had been nagging at me about whether regenerative agriculture truly could make a significant dent in the climate problem. And these 4 leaders showed me that, in fact, yes, regenerative agriculture can be an incredibly powerful climate solution, but it really matters how we approach it. So I'll tell you a little bit about each of these folks. These are the folks who are featured in Healing Grounds. There's a chapter dedicated to each of them. I'll just tell you a little bit about them now. Latrice Tatsey was the first person I spoke with. She's a soil ecologist from Blackfeet Nation in Northwest Montana. And her research focuses on the carbon sequestration potential of regenerative grazing. And like many regenerative grazing experts I've met and talked to, Latrice is a cattle producer who advocates for rotating livestock through pastures in patterns that mimic the movements of native herbivores, so as to regenerate vegetation and ultimately soil carbon. But for Latrice, native herbivores are more than just a theoretical model. So bison, or ini, as Latrice's people call them, are considered relatives and are central to the economy, diets, cultural, and spiritual traditions of the Blackfeet people, as they are for many people indigenous to the North American prairie. So Latrice isn't just using historical bison grazing as a model, she's actually part of an effort to restore bison themselves on the North American landscape, and not just within the contemporary Blackfeet reservation established by the US government, but throughout the historical territory of both her people and these native herbivores with whom they are so closely connected. And Latrice can rattle off a whole host of reasons why bison are needed to fully restore carbon-rich prairies. For one, by grazing selectively, bison create a diverse mosaic of vegetation across the prairie, which in turn supplies habitat for other species, including butterflies and endangered birds. Historically, when bison journeyed long distances, recently foraged vegetation had time to regrow before the animals came back. And to adapt to grazing pressure from these huge herbivores, prairie plants evolved to put a great deal of their efforts, their energy, underground to support their extensive root systems. And these root systems, in turn, delivered carbon into the soil, where it could be bound up in minerals and stored for eons. So over the millennia, bison helped build up the North American prairie into some of the most carbon-rich earth in the world. But more fundamentally, Latrice explained to me, bison are not only a keystone species, but a teacher. Throughout their long evolutionary history on the prairie, they have learned to live in balance with their environment, and their movements and grazing behavior are a lesson for anyone who is willing to learn. Historically, Latrice's people heeded this lesson and amplified the bison's regenerative impact on the prairie by setting carefully timed fires. And now Latrice is studying bison grazing as a model for regenerative grazing of both buffalo and cattle. Going forward, she hopes bison will be heeded for the even more profound lessons they have to teach about how to thrive on what is seasonally available and how to build a livelihood matched to the landscape. I also got to know Olivia Watkins, who farms mushrooms within a patch of forest in North Carolina that her family has managed for more than 130 years. When Olivia's great-great-uncle bought the place in 1890, he became one of the first Black landowners in the area. In the midst of rampant racial discrimination and outright racial violence, during a century when 98% of Black landowners were forcibly dispossessed of their land, this forest plot was a place of relative sanctuary for Olivia's ancestors, who initially lived off the land. And now, as the Research Triangle area of Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill is rapidly urbanizing, Olivia's land is one of the few pockets of diverse natural forest remaining, and thus also a sanctuary for wildlife and soil carbon. For Olivia, forest farming and agroforestry are a means of conservation in at least two senses. She conserves threatened forest, and she's also conserving threatened Black-owned land. Closer to home, where I live now in California, I met Aide Guzman, an ecologist conducting a first-of-its-kind study with immigrant farmers in California's Central Valley. As Guzman explained to me, in order to effectively sequester and store carbon, soils need to have a diverse and vibrant microbial community. And in order to have biodiversity below ground, you also need biodiversity above ground in the plant community. Or So scientists believe, based mostly on research conducted in natural areas like forests. This question isn't actually very well studied in agricultural landscapes in the US, Guzman explained to me, because in major agricultural regions like California's Central Valley, there's not a lot of agricultural biodiversity to study. But, and this is so cool, Guzman knew that there were hidden hotspots of biodiversity amidst the monocultures of almonds and grapes, because she herself grew up in the Central Valley, the daughter of farm workers who immigrated from their family's diversified small farm in Mexico. And she knew there were many families like hers, families with deep cultural traditions of growing multiple crops in diverse mixtures or polycultures, families who were farming this way on whatever patches of earth they could find. So using satellite maps and driving for hours down country roads, Guzman identified dozens of small farmers who agreed to participate in her study, comparing polycultures to monocultures. The polycultures, Guzman found, provided much better habitat for specialist native bees. But also, we'll switch out of the video here. The soil samples that Guzman analyzed from these polyculture farms had 2 times as many types of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which is an indicator of that critical below ground biodiversity that is so important for carbon sequestration and other ecosystem services provided by soil. Growing up in the Central Valley, Guzman told me, she heard a lot of narratives about immigrants, not all of them positive. But as her data clearly show, the Mexican, Central American, and Southeast Asian farmers with whom she partnered on her research are literally bringing Central Valley soils back to life. And then finally, just down the road from the little town of Firebaugh, California, where Aide Guzman grew up, Nikiko Masimoto cultivates 80 acres of peaches, nectarines, apricots, and raisin grapes, the 3rd generation to steward her family's Del Rey, California farm. Nikiko's grandparents bought the land and planted the first trees. Her dad, Moss, converted the farm to certified organic production some 30 years ago. Walking the same land as those who came before her, Nikiko thinks a lot about her ancestors. Without that generational connection, Nikiko says, much of the soil building work on her family's land might never have happened. When her dad decided to come back to the farm in the 70s, they planted trees her grandfather wouldn't have been able to tend on his own. And when she returned 3 decades later, the horizon for investing in the land expanded again. There is a gift of that, Nikiko says, which is thinking of my life in a lineage that is much more important than my own individual life. So many of the methods that develop soil take time. The horizon is long. When you're wanting to leave a farm to several generations in the future, you have a vested interest in taking up those practices. But digging into her family's history is also a painful and complicated process. Discriminated against as immigrants, Nikiko's great-grandparents never owned the land they worked. What little savings they had built up was lost during Japanese-American internment, when some 120,000 people, most of them US citizens, were incarcerated for years simply because of their Japanese descent. So Nikiko's grandparents had to start from scratch, eking out a living on marginal land as they gradually built up the soil. We are the ones that the world needs in this climate crisis, Nikiko says, referring not just to Japanese Americans, but to other communities of color who have experienced oppression. Because we have those stories. We have that sense of fighting against the impossible. So speaking to these 4 regenerative agriculture leaders filled me with hope. Each one of them laid out a powerful vision for how regenerative agriculture could significantly address climate change, and they were already putting these plans into action restoring prairies, conserving forests, and demonstrating the benefits of planting polycultures and cycling nutrients. But they also made me think differently about what regenerative agriculture is and what it needs to be in order to truly address climate change and shift the destructive course of agricultural business as usual. The first key lesson I learned from the regenerative agriculture leaders I spoke to for this book is that regenerative agriculture is not new. Yes, strategies like cover cropping and regenerative grazing may be new ideas to many US farmers who, much like my great-grandfather, have been taught that soil fertility comes out of a package and monocultures are more efficient. But these industrial approaches to farming are really only about 75 years old, just a minor blip in the long history of human land management. Meanwhile, indigenous food systems have employed what we now term regenerative practices for thousands of years. For example, on this continent, indigenous people have long understood the regenerative relationship among prairies, grazing, and fire. The African continent has a long history of agroforestry, a practice that continues throughout the African diaspora. As Soul Fire Farm co-founder Leah Penniman notes, Ghanaian farmers have developed numerous polycultures of trees and row crops, as have the Hausa farmers of Nigeria, who utilize at least 156 such systematic crop combinations. On the African savanna, farmers protect a number of valued tree species, planting their crops around them rather than cutting them down. And in the tropics, African farmers intercrop vegetables, grains, and trees in multiple layers, creating a multi-tiered canopy structure that mimics natural forest cover and buffers the soil from heavy rainfall that could otherwise cause erosion. As geographers Judith Carney and Richard Razumov put it, these farmers have transformed a rainforest into a food forest. And polycultures are also a staple of indigenous food systems in Latin America, particularly the Three Sisters trio of corn, beans, and squash that spread throughout what indigenous scholar Devin Pena terms the indigenous corn belt. I love this map, long before European contact. And if you've ever wondered where organic farmers and the organic farming community got the idea for their nutrient cycling practices, composting, mulching, and planting cover crops, one of the primary answers to that question is Asia. So when University of Wisconsin soil physicist Franklin Hiram King took a 9-month tour of Asian farms in 1909, he was struck by the absence of mineral fertilizers, which most of his university colleagues at the time considered essential. Instead, King observed, the farmers he met in Japan, Korea, and China, home to the first recorded use of cover crops, quote, returned to their fields every form of waste which can replace plant food removed by the crops, with an almost religious fidelity. These nations, King wrote in his classic book, Farmers of 40 Centuries, have demonstrated a grasp of essentials and of fundamental principles, which may well cause Western nations to pause and reflect. King died young, and while his wife eventually managed to publish his book posthumously, it didn't immediately take off. But in the meantime, not long after King's trip to East Asia, the British government sent botanist Sir Albert Howard to India, which was then a British colony. Howard was supposed to teach modern scientific techniques to Indian farmers. Instead of teaching, however, Howard and his wife, Gabrielle Mathey, also a botanist, found themselves learning. Howard was particularly taken with the Indian farmers' system of composting, which he wrote up in English as the indoor composting process. The process and the philosophy behind it would form the core of Howard's An Agricultural Testament and The Soil and Health, books that have strongly influenced the organic farming movements in both England and the US. So these are just a few examples among many that I came across in the course of my research. And I think the key point when we're thinking about the regenerative agriculture movement in the US is this. regenerative agriculture is rooted in the ancestral knowledge of communities of color. It's essential to recognize, credit, and take leadership from peoples indigenous to this continent, not just those who've tended prairies, but also those who've tended wild rice beds, the ahupua'a of Hawaii, the climate adaptive seeds of the desert Southwest, and the other indigenous territories that make up the contemporary United States. And it's also essential to recognize, credit, and take leadership from regenerative agriculture leaders whose ancestors were indigenous to Africa, Mesoamerica, and Asia. Each of these diverse communities have spent decades, sometimes centuries, on the front lines of extractive agriculture. Drawing on ancestral knowledge, they have honed the practice of regenerative agriculture as a means of survival and resistance. So arguably the first US scientist to reject industrial farming and call for regenerative organic approaches was Professor George Washington Carver, who began his illustrious career at Tuskegee University in 1897. So in the early 20th century, as Carver was starting his career, his scientific colleagues began abandoning biological soil health strategies in favor of newly developed commercial chemical fertilizers. But Carver was concerned that promoting fertilizer purchases would leave Black sharecroppers in debt to white planters, undermining their chances for social and economic liberation. So he conducted path-breaking research on cover cropping, crop rotation, and especially compost, which he termed nature's choicest fertilizer. And in Mexico, also in the early part of the 20th century, indigenous scientist Efraim Hernandez Zolocotzi founded the modern discipline of agroecology after finding himself on the front lines of the Green Revolution. So as a young scientist collecting germplasm for the Rockefeller Foundation in Mexico, Zolocotzi became more and more dubious about the efforts his seed collection was supporting as he watched the saga of agricultural development play out. Wealthy farmers using chemicals and irrigation subsidized by Rockefeller and the Mexican government exploited Mexico's lowlands, churning out record-breaking yields. Prices fell and markets dramatically restructured, undercutting the very small farmers who had so generously shared their seeds with Zolocotzi, believing in his humanitarian mission. Zolocotzi watched in horror as these small farmers were squeezed out of their livelihoods, jeopardizing not only one of the world's greatest living archives of agricultural diversity, but millennia of knowledge about how to raise these plants in balance with their surroundings. So the star recruit of the Mexican Agricultural Project started speaking out, speaking proudly about his indigenous Nahuatl heritage and questioning the doctrine that Mexico needed to be modernized. In 1978, he would co-host a landmark seminar, Agroecosystems, with an emphasis on the study of traditional agricultural technology, where the contemporary field of agroecology was born. So again, these are just a couple examples among many I came across in the course of my research. And there's so many more stories about how communities of color have developed regenerative agriculture as a means of survival and resistance, and they are unfolding as we speak. In the context of climate change, these communities again find themselves on the front lines of extractive agriculture, which both deepens the climate problem and undermines climate resilience. But now, while frontline communities suffer first and foremost, the whole planet is ultimately in danger. So this need to take leadership from these communities that already know all about regenerative agriculture as a survival strategy is an urgent matter. So this brings me to the other key lesson I learned from talking with the regenerative agriculture leaders I told you about earlier, who, as you may have noticed, are all women of color. We need to be clear about why we have an extractive form of agriculture in the US today. And we have this extractive form of agriculture because it emanates from the legacy of colonization. So all that soil carbon that was lost from US farmland over the past few centuries, that was part of a larger process of extraction, a process of stealing land, resources, and even people, a process of exporting wealth out of communities and concentrating it in the hands of a powerful elite. As part of this process, nearly all 30 million bison in North America were killed over the course of the 19th century. And as land speculators and the US military understood, their strategy of exterminating most of these animals would profoundly undermine the way of life that had supported the people of the plains for thousands of years. In the place of the buffalo that had evolved with these grasslands, European American ranchers imported cattle, which had been domesticated in ways that made human management easier, but also necessary. To accommodate the needs of their cows, these ranchers began modifying the landscape. They manipulated water, they grew feed, but most consequentially, they built fences, carving the West into discrete tracts of private property where forage could be assessed, bought, and sold as a capital asset. With federal coordination and financing, thousands of miles of fences were built, turning indigenous territory and open range into ranches. In a landscape where survival had long required mobility, life was now frozen in place. Simultaneously, indigenous people, those who had survived the military campaigns intended to kill them, were likewise rounded up and confined within the boundaries of reservations. The newly designated territories covered merely a tiny fraction of these people's ancestral homelands, often places that were habitable only in particular seasons. They were told it was for their own good, their own protection, that they would be more productive in settlement than migration. In the early 20th century, these attempts to, quote, modernize both the people and the landscapes of the American West were so tightly intertwined that, quote, Indian affairs and range management were often overseen by the same officials. They sought to homogenize and standardize to make life legible so that it could be readily managed. They carved up interdependent communities into discrete individuals, erecting literal barriers between formerly connected lives. And in place of self-determining groups, they sought to create what Chief Justice John Marshall termed domestic dependent nations, populations that could not survive on their own, but must submit to hierarchical control. And of course, this was not the only time lands would be taken. At the close of the Civil War, as the nation wrestled with how to incorporate nearly 4 million formerly enslaved people into the fabric of society, a group of Black ministers approached Union General William T. Sherman. Their request? An allotment of 40 acres for each freed Black family. The general agreed, issuing Field Order 15, which would forever be remembered as the promise of 40 acres and a mule. But shortly thereafter, President Andrew Johnson rescinded the order. In the decades that followed, white Southerners would attempt to recreate both the economic and political conditions of slavery by any means necessary. Many Southern states passed laws prohibiting Black people from owning or even leasing property. Frequently, the only option available to Black farmers was sharecropping, an exploitative system that was manipulated by white planters and merchants to keep Black farmers in debt. When Black families did manage to acquire land, they frequently faced severe discrimination and outright violence. More than 4,000 African Americans were lynched between 1877 and 1950, many of them landowners who were targeted for upsetting the racial hierarchy of white supremacy. Yet despite all this, Black farmers kept gaining ground, and by 1920, 925,000 of them owned the land they farmed. But then the financial racism started. So the Great Depression devastated the agriculture sector in the US, as my family experienced, spurring the first major federal programs to support farmers. But these programs, and critically, the low-interest loans they offered, were administered through local committees that in the South were dominated by white planters whose worldviews had changed little since Reconstruction. Many Black farmers were flatly denied the government loans to which they were entitled. Applications were thrown in the trash, unread, and Black applicants would be kept waiting for hours while white constituents were served. When loans were provided to Black applicants, they were smaller than those offered to white applicants with similarly sized farms. The result of this thinly veiled onslaught of financial racism was a tidal wave of foreclosures and tax sales, which ultimately proved more devastating to Black land ownership than the violent mobs of the early 20th century. Between 1950 and 1975, 500,000 Black farms went out of business, forfeiting a total of 6 million acres in the years between 1950 and 1969 alone. As journalist Van Newkirk has calculated, this pencils out to an average daily hemorrhage of 820 acres, an area the size of New York's Central Park erased with each sunset. And despite the warnings of Efraim Hernandez Zolocotzi and his colleagues, the US and Mexican governments pressed forward with the Green Revolution in Mexico, with devastating impacts on traditional farming systems. Whole families abandoned their rural villages. Agrobiodiversity declined. Formerly self-sufficient in corn, Mexico became a net importer of the staple grain by 1970. Food prices began to rise. Thousands of financially insecure farmers like Aide Guzman's parents sought work as farm laborers in the United States, where they were systematically denied full citizenship. This practice of exploiting displaced immigrants was not new, as in fact, waves of immigrants from Asia had had a similar experience. In late 19th and early 20th century California, the story repeated itself with one Asian immigrant community after another. Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Punjabi. They came as farm workers. They hoped to become farmers, but they were systematically denied access to citizenship and land ownership, ensuring that agribusiness would always have access to a pool of legally insecure laborers. So clearly, this is not a playbook for justice. And it's also not a playbook for ecological survival. Ecological survival requires reciprocal relationships between soil and plants, plants and animals, and ultimately between people and land. So in researching this book and talking with ecologists who specialize in regenerative agriculture, I've noticed a common refrain, which is roots. So whether they study soil building cover crops, breed perennial grains, or work to help ranchers optimize grazing strategies, all of these ecologists are fundamentally after the same goal. How can we keep living roots in the ground all year round? Roots literally are carbon, and they also secrete a lot of carbon in the form of exudates that feed soil microbes. Carbon exuded by plant roots is nutritious and easy for microbes to digest. As a result, carbon from plant roots is 5 times more likely than above ground carbon to be stabilized as organic matter in soil. So a regenerative agriculture clearly must be a deeply rooted one. And yet colonization and its extraction playbook have been uprooting both people and the plants they tend for hundreds of years. So how can the extractive processes of colonization be healed? How can we ensure that people are able to put down roots? So first of all, just to briefly recap where we've been today, food systems account for 1/4 to 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. And we know that even though agriculture is currently a climate problem, it can transform into a climate solution. Those climate solutions in agriculture have deep histories in Indigenous communities and communities of color. But in the face of colonization, these communities have not been able to implement these practices and have had to struggle even to keep them in their living memory. And one of the main reasons for this is that agricultural land in the United States, 98% of it is white owned. That's not an accident. It is the historical legacy of this Indigenous dispossession, of Black land loss, of the labor system that has brought immigrants to work in agriculture in this country, but not afforded them opportunities for secure land tenure themselves. So how on earth are any of these people supposed to practice the long-term strategies necessary to regenerate soil carbon? So, to talk a little bit about what I see as some of the real North Stars and exciting work happening to address these really big challenges. In the last chapter of this book, I got to interview folks who lead two kind of next generation land trusts. One of them being Stephanie Morningstar, who you see pictured here, who is the executive director of the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. And they have this really interesting model that bridges a conservation land trust and a community land trust. So in the short term, they're negotiating equitable leases for farmers of color, vetting landowners to ensure that terms are fair and the place and relationship provide a safer space. But long term, they're working to acquire thousands of acres of land with the goal of providing affordable long-term leases to some 50 farmers of color who commit to regenerative agriculture covenants. And most importantly, Stephanie emphasized to me, the land trust doesn't do anything without first consulting the Indigenous communities who are the original stewards of the land. So they work to create cultural respect easements, which stipulate specific forms of Indigenous access or Indigenous informed management of land. Things such as harvesting, access rights, hunting, ceremony, reburial of ancestors, or leaving it open to definition by the Indigenous nation as these needs become more clear over time. There's also a group doing this work in California, where I live now, called Minnow. They actually just launched their website in the last week, so I encourage you to check out weareminnow.org. They have a bunch of stories up there about their work. And doing similar work, really looking at Indigenous land rematriation and farmland access for farmers of color as synergistic, rather than as objectives that would be pitted against one another. Actually, all the folks I spoke to in the book are working on similar kinds of efforts around land justice and land access. Aide Guzman and Nikiko Masumoto here in California, Latrice Tatsy in her community at Blackfeet Nation, working on land sovereignty. And Olivia Watkins is now president of Black Farmer Fund, which is building wealth for Black farmers and food businesses, quote, to repair Black communities' relationship to food and land. So all of this work on land justice has been really inspiring to me. I think it's really at the core of moving a regenerative agriculture forward that really tackles these problems at its root causes. And I wanted to leave you with a quote from Stephanie Morningstar that I thought really sums this up. So what she told me when I asked her, near the end of our interview, to kind of clarify what the climate crisis even really is and what it means to work towards climate healing, she said, what we are doing is we are healing our ancestral lineages. It's about going back to the root issues, Indigenous land dispossession and enslavement. How do we right those relationships between our own communities so that we can heal those things in this healing ground? So healing the climate means healing land, I asked, trying to follow her train of thought. And healing land means healing colonization. That's it, she said. That's the work. So that's what I have for you this evening. Thank you so much for all of your attention and engagement. And if we have time, I would be delighted to take any questions that you have.
Boom, Liz Carlisle. Thank you. Fantastic. I really appreciate your work. This was so well done. Let me remove spotlight here.
And I'll get the actual light going here in the room. We're working to, do our part to not add to climate change, hence the motion detector lights here in the farm classroom. So hang on a second. See if I can wave at them and wake them up. Maybe after 5 o'clock, they don't want to wake up. We'll do this campfire style.
Yeah. Yeah, Liz, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I see that right off the bat here, we have Evan Hudson from across the river over in Dubuque, Iowa.
Oh, I saw Sister Gemma.
Any attempt to find common ground with traditional US farmers?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And that's my own family background. And my mother was born and raised in Waterloo, Iowa. After losing their land, a bunch of my family on my mother's side worked at John Deere. And of course, over the last decade or so, I've worked a lot in central and eastern Montana, including with a lot of farmers whose background is in commodity wheat. And I think, something that I hear echoed in a lot of different ways, people coming at it from their own backgrounds and through their own lenses, is that an extractive agriculture ultimately harms us all. And some of our communities have come to that insight sooner than others. But ultimately, I think climate change really clarifies that when we have an extractive relationship with land, when we create a food system based on extraction that isn't giving back to those lands that feed us, ultimately, we are creating a very bad situation for our children and our grandchildren and the next generations. And so, in all of my work, whether it's with, wheat farmers in Montana who are trying to transition to pulse crops, or with the farmers I spoke about this evening, I think all of these folks see that we need to move away from extraction. I think an increasing number of people see the tie between colonial processes and extraction and see this history, and really want to solve the problem at its roots. I think a lot of the farmers I've spoken with are tired of kind of surface level hand waving at small fixes when they see that they really want the next generations of their family to have to enjoy like a really beautiful life on land. So I do think that this is work for all of us to move away from extraction and towards a mutually beneficial relationship with land and with each other. I think these are difficult conversations because we don't all come from the same standpoint. We have different levels of privilege. Some of us have benefited from colonization and extraction in various ways. And so we have to work through those things. But none of us in the long run benefit from the continued processes of extraction. So I've been excited to see more of these conversations happening across communities. I think in the time I've been working on these issues. And I think, something like the Farm Bill is a great opportunity to talk about our common interest in community food systems.
Thanks, Liz. Evan, you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation, and thanks. I'm happy to be here. Talking just now, it reminded me of I'm a master's.
Evan, you're breaking up. I'd say take off your if you could take off your video, maybe that'll come through a little clearer.
Solidarity. I've been having internet issues all day, so.
Of course. When I think about also is a
Evan, you're still breaking up. I wonder if you could stick your question into the chat.
Okay, I'll do that. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Liz, I'm wondering if you know of any stories of reparation and land return. You write a little bit about reparations from the government angle in the book. Do you know of any sort of reparations from below?
Yeah, I'm really interested in those stories. So if anybody on this call knows of them, I would love to hear what you're hearing about. I think, so both of these groups, Minnow and Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, are trying to create vehicles for reparation. And they've had some successes so far. So definitely check out weareminnow.org because they've just posted a couple of these stories of some of the projects that are starting to come to fruition for them. We've had a couple of wins recently in the state of California with Indigenous groups reclaiming some of their land through a variety of processes. Some folks purchasing it back There was one case that Minna was involved in that I think involved our Department of Transportation. It was a kind of a unique case where there had been, the history was researched about how I think eminent domain was used by the Caltrans, which is our Department of Transportation, and ultimately that land was returned to an Indigenous community just in this last year. I think that story is on Minno's website. So there are, some really promising stories. I've also been really inspired. You all are going to have to remind me the name of the Nebraska farmer who has been working with the movement to stop pipelines. And as part of that, rematriated a portion of the farm to an Indigenous community to plant Indigenous corn as this really powerful statement about two visions of land.
Yeah, that is the Tanderup family. I was actually interviewing last week Margaret Jacobs, who is working on a documentary about them and other examples of land return.
Amazing. Yeah. Well, let's all watch that documentary. Let's have movie night.
Yes. Evan's got a very long question here. Brenna, in the meantime, while I read Evan's question here, and Brenna, will you do a little Nuns and Nuns pitch here for what's coming up as well before we close out?
I sure will. Thanks. Yeah, as Eric mentioned at the beginning, this webinar tonight was brought to you not only by Sinsinawa Mound, but also several of you came to us through the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice website. I'm going to share my screen with you here. The Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Project works with religious communities and movement partners to create land transitions that are rooted in ecological and racial healing. So this is one of several learning and educational opportunities that we're offering this fall. And I was really happy to hear Liz talk about land justice and how we're defining it. It's very similar to what Liz was just explaining, how we define it at Nuns and Nuns as having three really important components: protecting land from extraction, regenerating land's health, and then especially expanding land equity to Black, Indigenous, and other communities who've been systematically dispossessed of that land, which, as Liz explained really well, has led to the climate and ecological crisis that we're in, this process of colonization. So returning that land is part of returning the land to its health. And just an upcoming webinar on December 8th, 1 to 2:30 Eastern time, we'll hear from Callie Walker and Duran Chavis of the Central Virginia Agrarian Commons. Callie donated 100 acres of her family's land to the Commons in order to support Black food sovereignty in Virginia. And the Central Virginia Agrarian Commons is a network of Black, Indigenous, and people of color farmers and commonly held lands. So here you'll get a chance to hear from both Callie and Duran about the details of this land transition that was rooted in land justice. So that's coming up. You can find it at nunsandnuns.org/landlearning. We hope you can join us.
Awesome.
Thanks, Brenna. Let's see if we can squeeze Evan's question in here. Liz, can you see that in the chat?
Yes. A and B, 2 questions.
Yes, and asking about refi projects. Are you familiar with this?
No.
Okay. So that maybe answers Evan's question, and then the Sinsinawa community, maybe someone from Sinsinawa could answer in the chat. That's a kind of a side issue about the future of Sinsinawa land. And then maybe Isabel asked if there's time, was this book and research somewhat ignited in response to your previous book, Lentil Underground, which seemed to focus solely on white Montana farmers?
Yeah, definitely. My whole body of writing is a journey that I've been on. And I think every layer has helped me understand the issues more deeply. So absolutely. I think a lot of times, at least in my life, when there's a problem that I recognize is is in front of me as a barrier to the life that I want to build for myself and my community, I initially see the kind of surface layer of that problem and the way it's impacting me. And then over time, I see more of how it came to be. And so it's just been a real privilege to get to learn from others to understand more of the context of how we got to be where we are.
Thank you, Liz. Again, the book is Healing Grounds. Recommend that everyone reads it. One of the most important books that I've read recently. So thank you for all of that work and amplifying the voices and work of people of color. That's just hugely important, leading the way. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Liz. I invite you to unmute yourself and offer your gratitude to Liz or in the chat.
I'm going to jump in first and say thank you so much for the amazing work you all are doing. I'm so inspired by this series. So it's really a privilege to be among you. And thanks for the invitation to join you this evening.
Thank you for coming and speaking. Yes.
Thank you so much for your work and your scholarship and sharing it with us.
Yeah, thank you